in the darkest nights of the Second World War, when the moon hid behind thick clouds and the cold wind scraped across the open plains of the Eastern Front, a sound would rise in the stillness of the sky, a soft whispering rush of air, almost too faint to notice, almost too fragile to be real. German soldiers who heard it would freeze, listening with wide eyes, because they knew what followed. They knew that the quiet brushing of wind overhead was not nature. It was not birds. It was not ghosts, though many whispered that it was. It was the warning before the storm, the moment before destruction. It was the arrival of the Soviet Union's most terrifying and unexpected weapon, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans called them Nachtwechseln, the Night Witches. No name could have been more fitting. The Night Witches flew tiny, lightweight wooden biplanes that seemed ridiculous for war, aircraft that looked more like flying school trainers or crop dusters than military machines. They had no armor, no radios, no navigation equipment, and almost no instruments. The slightest bullet could tear through their wings. The wind could push them off course. One spark could ignite their fabric-covered planes. Yet these women took those fragile, outdated machines into the heart of darkness night after night, flying in freezing temperatures, under constant fire, with engines that coughed and sputtered and vibrated like they were ready to collapse. What they lacked in technology they replaced with skill, audacity, and absolute fearlessness. Their mission was simple but deadly. Every night, they were to launch from rough airstrips scratched into the fields and forests, fly deep into enemy-controlled territory, locate German supply depots, camps, trenches, and troop formations, and drop small bombs with ruthless precision. These bombs did not destroy cities or end wars. They destroyed sleep. They destroyed nerves. They destroyed morale. They reminded every German soldier on the Eastern Front that danger came not only from massive artillery or roaring Stuka dive bombers, but from the whisper of old wooden wings in the night. The Night Witches made rest impossible. They turned darkness into a battlefield. They turned fear into a weapon. Their presence was a psychological assault as much as a physical one. The story of the Night Witches began far from the front lines, far from the frozen plains of Russia, deep inside the vast machinery of the Soviet Union during the desperate early days of the war. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Entire divisions were wiped out. Cities fell with terrifying speed. The need for soldiers, pilots, and specialists was immediate and overwhelming. In these early weeks, patriotic volunteers flooded recruitment centers. Among them were thousands of women who demanded to serve not as nurses or clerks, but as combatants. The Soviet government hesitated. Women in combat aviation was not only unconventional, it was unthinkable. But in the chaos of invasion, hesitation was a luxury the USSR could not afford. One woman refused to accept no. Marina Raskova, aviator, navigator, record breaker, and national hero, was known throughout the country as the Russian Amelia Earhart. When the war began, she used her reputation and influence to demand the creation of all-female military aviation unit. She argued not for equality, but for necessity. Women could fly. Women could fight. The motherland needed every capable hand. Stalin eventually agreed, signing the order that formed 3 female regiments, one for fighters, one for heavy bombers, and one for night harassment bombers. The latter became the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a unit destined to become one of the most feared aviation forces of the entire war. The women who arrived for training were young, many barely out of school. Some had grown up on farms. Some had worked in factories. Some had dreamed of becoming pilots since childhood, but most had never flown anything larger than a glider. They came from cities and villages, from wealthy families and working-class homes. What united them was their determination to fight. They faced grueling training. They learned to fly in the worst possible conditions. They navigated by stars, by rivers, by instinct. They practiced night takeoffs and landings until their eyes burned with exhaustion. Their instructors demanded perfection. A single mistake in training could mean death in combat. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov P-2, was both a curse and a blessing. Designed as a training plane in the 1920s, it was slower than most cars. It could not outrun anything. It could not outclimb anything. But its slow speed gave it an advantage. German fighters often overshot when trying to intercept them. Its wooden frame made it invisible to many early radar systems. Its simple controls allowed pilots to glide with the engine off, producing the eerie whispering sound that terrified German troops. These planes were death traps, and they were also perfect for the mission. The women wore men's uniforms too large for them. They stuffed boots with newspaper to make them fit. They cut off hair to keep it from freezing in the open cockpit. They painted their lips with charcoal to fight against the cold. Their gloves stiffened with frost. Their cheeks cracked from icy wind. Their fingers went numb on metal controls. They flew without parachutes during the early months because the planes couldn't lift the extra weight. If shot down, they had no hope. If hit by flak, the plane would ignite instantly. If the engine failed, they glided into darkness and hoped they could find an empty field before slamming into trees. Still they volunteered. Still they flew. The first missions of the 588th Regiment were small. They flew in groups of 3. The first plane would flare to distract German searchlights and gunners. The second would draw the fire. The third, flying with the engine cut off, nearly silent, would glide over the target and drop the bombs. Then they would switch roles, each pilot taking turns at the most dangerous position. Their teamwork was flawless. Their discipline unshakable. Their courage relentless. Soon German soldiers began reporting strange attacks from invisible planes. They described hearing a faint swishing whisper, like a broom sweeping across the sky. Then explosions. Then silence. Then another whisper. Then more fire. They said the women flew like ghosts. They said they moved like shadows. They said they were witches. The name spread quickly. The Witches of the Night. The Night Witches accepted the name as a badge of honor. As the war intensified, their missions grew more dangerous. They flew up to 15 sorties in one night, their bodies exhausted, their eyes burning, their hands frozen, their nerves stretched thin. They returned to base to refuel and reload, then took off again within minutes. They slept in brief snatches during the day. They ate when they could. They repaired damaged planes by hand. They held the line when the Soviet front collapsed. They bombed German supply columns. They harassed infantry. They struck rail hubs, ammunition depots, communication lines, trenches, and river crossings. Their bombs were small but precise. Their psychological impact was enormous. German units could not rest. Their nights became torture. The Night Witches faced not only the enemy but constant sexism and skepticism from their own commanders. Men doubted they could endure the front. Men mocked their small planes. Men told them they were too fragile, too emotional, too weak. The Night Witches ignored them. They flew through storms. They flew through blizzards. They flew under artillery fire. They flew at treetop level, scraping branches with their wings. They flew so close to the ground that sometimes their wheels kicked up snow or mud. They flew until their engines seized, until their fuel froze, until their bodies trembled from fatigue. One by one, the women of the regiment built reputations as fearless warriors. They earned medals, titles, and respect. Some became legends before they were even 20 years old. But the war demanded sacrifices. Planes vanished into darkness. Crews did not return. Wreckage was found burned in open field. Pilots were lost behind enemy lines. Every woman knew the risk. Every woman kept flying. Their base camps were makeshift and crude. They lived in barracks with thin walls, slept on iron bunks, ate cold soup, and washed in icy water. Their planes were lined up under the open sky, covered with tarps, protected only by camouflage nets and piles of brush. Mechanics worked in darkness with numb hands. Ground crews lifted bombs using whatever tools they could find. Engines were warmed by burning rags and lanterns. The sound of P-2 engines coughing to life became a soundtrack of the night. The night witches adapted to every challenge. They navigated using the dim outlines of rivers and road. They memorized landscapes so thoroughly that even in darkness they could sense where they were. They learned to anticipate German searchlights. They studied flak patterns. They watched how the enemy reacted to decoy attacks. They flew low to avoid radar, climbing just enough to clear trees. They dropped bombs from altitudes so low that fragments struck their planes. Their bravery bordered on madness, and yet it was calculated, controlled, and precise. Every night they launched into blackness with no guarantee of return. Every night they faced death not with resignation but with determination. They laughed through terror. They joked through fatigue. They supported each other with fierce loyalty. They fought not only for their country, but for each other, driven by a bond stronger than fear. The cold was their constant enemy. It froze their eyelashes. It stiffened their joints. It burned their skin. At high altitudes, the wind cut through their clothes like knives. Their scarves froze to their faces. Their breath crystallized on their goggles. But the night protected them. Darkness was their ally. Silence was their weapon. The enemy feared what they could not see. As the front lines shifted, the night witches moved with them. They abandoned bases quickly, packing up everything they could carry, leaving behind only footprints and ashes. They advanced into liberated territories, seeing destroyed villages and burned homes. They saw the horrors left by retreating German forces. Their anger deepened. Their resolve sharpened. Through winter, spring, summer, and autumn they flew without rest. Their regiment completed more than 23,000 missions. They dropped thousands of tons of explosives. They shattered enemy supply lines. They contributed to major Soviet advances. They fought at Stalingrad, the Caucasus, Belarus, Poland, and all the way to Germany. They flew until the very last nights of the war. The night witches became a symbol of courage, resilience, and defiance. But in the early years, as their legend rose, no one could imagine how much more they would endure, how many battles lay ahead, and how deeply their story would carve itself into the history of warfare. Their journey was only beginning. As the war deepened and the front expanded into a vast and shifting line stretching across thousands of kilometers, the operations of the night witches became more demanding, more dangerous, and more relentless than ever. Their lives fused into a cycle of darkness, flight, fire, and exhaustion. Night after night, they repeated the same sequence, preparing their fragile planes, lifting bombs with frozen hands, checking fabric wings for bullet holes, tightening loose wires, memorizing coordinates, calculating fuel limits, pulling their scarves tight against the wind, climbing into open cockpits, and rising into the cold black sky where death waited unseen. Their world was narrowed to a few constant sensations: the sting of frost against skin, the roar of engines sputtering in the cold, the smell of gasoline and oil, the weight of bombs strapped under the wings, and the tension that lived in their chests before every flight. They existed in a state of perpetual readiness. Daylight offered little rest. They slept in short bursts, wrapped in blankets that never fully warmed them. Bomb crates were stacked around their barrack. Pilots and navigators shared cramped spaces where silence often dominated, each woman absorbing the weight of the previous night. When one bunk was empty in the morning, everyone noticed. When two were empty, the room felt like a tomb. Their regiment developed a rhythm of survival. Ground crews, many of them women too, worked constantly to keep the ancient Patus alive. These planes were simple but unforgiving. Engines broke. Fuel lines froze. Canvas tore. Bomb racks bent. At times mechanics used whatever tools they could find, hammering dents with rocks or tightening bolts with makeshift wrenches. Sometimes they repaired aircraft by lamplight, kneeling in mud as rain fell or snow drifted around them. More than once they mended wings with plywood, fabric, or metal scraps scavenged from destroyed villages. Any plane that could fly, even barely, was sent back into the sky. There was no choice. The war allowed no luxury of perfection. Despite the chaos around them, the night witches forged a culture of discipline and precision. Each pilot trusted her navigator absolutely. Each navigator knew the stars better than most astronomers. Together they formed a perfect union of instinct and calculation. Navigators leaned out of open cockpits, wind tearing at their scarves, scanning the ground for faint shapes of rivers, roads, and forests. They navigated by memory when clouds hid the sky. They calculated bombing angles while bullets sliced through the night around them. They made split-second decisions that often meant the difference between hitting the target and dying in flames. Their missions increased in complexity as the Soviet High Command realized how effective they were. The regiment was moved frequently to support different fronts: south to defend oil fields in the Caucasus, north to support the defense of Stalingrad, west toward Belarus and Poland as Soviet forces began pushing the Germans back. Each relocation meant abandoning whatever comfort they had built. They packed tools, tarps, fuel drums, bombs, radios, tents, and engines into trucks. They dismantled makeshift stoves and collected every last part of their aircraft maintenance equipment. They traveled through muddy roads, snowstorms, and forests filled with the echoes of retreating enemy troops. Upon arrival, they rebuilt the airfield from scratch, leveling ground by hand, clearing debris, erecting shelters, and marking crude runways with oil lanterns or small fires. Wherever they arrived, German forces quickly learned to fear the night again. One of the defining periods of their history came during the German assault on the Caucasus. The Luftwaffe sought to seize oil fields vital to the Soviet war effort, and the Night Witches were among those deployed to slow the German advance. They flew over mountains in pitch darkness, rising through freezing air that clawed at their exposed skin. Strong winds smashed against their fragile wings. Snow blinded them. Turbulence threw their planes off course. More than once pilots clipped treetops or grazed rocky ridges hidden beneath darkness. But they did not break. They bombed German supply lines, harassed troops moving through mountain passes, and forced the enemy to scatter operations across the region. Their missions were so constant that German soldiers joked grimly that even in the mountains there was no escaping the endless whisper of the witches' wings. During the brutal winter of 1942-43, as the Battle of Stalingrad raged, the Night Witches were pushed to their physical limit. They flew into territory lit by the burning ruins of the city, a landscape where factories stood as smoking skeletons, where the Volga River flowed in patches of dark water and ice, and where the horizon glowed orange from constant fire. Anti-aircraft guns surrounded German positions. Searchlights probed the sky night after night. The Night Witches learned to dance between beams of light like shadows with wings. They maneuvered with breathtaking precision, cutting their engines to glide through darkness, letting gravity pull them toward their targets in silence. Bombs dropped with deadly accuracy, exploding among German trenches, vehicles, and piled ammunition. The German defenders at Stalingrad dreaded the sunset, knowing that the silence of night would be broken again and again by the approach of the witches. One of the unofficial traditions of the regiment emerged during this period. Each time a crew returned safely, the women shared whatever small joy they could: hot tea, a scrap of bread, laughter, a joke whispered in exhaustion. Each return was a victory. Each safe landing was a miracle. But the losses mounted. Planes vanished into the burning landscape. Some were shot down. Some became lost in drifting snow. Some returned with torn wings and leaking fuel, landing hard on frozen ground. Others never returned at all. The sorrow weighed heavily on them, yet every night they returned to the sky. The Night Witches developed a tactic that became legendary. They approached their target at higher altitude with their engines roaring, attracting German attention. Then, just before reaching the front line, they cut the engines entirely. Silence swallowed the air. Only the wind brushed the wings, producing that eerie broom-like whisper. German soldiers panicked. Searchlights swept wildly across the sky. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly. In that quiet descent, the women steadied their planes with iron nerves, guiding them like gliders toward the drop zone. At the last possible moment they released the bombs, then restarted the engines with a burst of noise and escaped before German gunners could adjust their aim. This method terrified enemy troops so deeply that many wrote in letters and diaries that the witches seemed supernatural, as though they controlled the night itself. Their success made them target. German artillery units learned to recognize the sound of P-2 engines. Fighter pilots were ordered specifically to hunt them down. But catching a P-2 was harder than it seemed. The planes flew so slowly that German fighters often overshot them, unable to reduce speed sufficiently for a clean shot. Some German pilots compared trying to shoot down a P-2 to trying to hit a butterfly with a cannon. But the danger was still very real. Many night witches were attacked mid-mission. Some escaped by dropping to treetop height, weaving between branches. Others evaded capture by diving into valleys or banking sharply over rivers. A few engaged in deadly spirals, spinning their planes to confuse the enemy. Some did not escape. Crumpled wreckage burned in forests and fields, silent testimony to their sacrifice. As their fame grew, resentment from some male Soviet officers deepened. Jealousy crept in. Some argued that the night witches were receiving too much praise. Others tried to minimize their achievements. Even so, they earned respect in ways that could not be ignored. Their results spoke louder than any criticism. They completed far more missions than many male regiments. Their survival rate, given their equipment, exceeded all expectations. Their courage was undeniable. They were also extremely resourceful. When materials ran out, they repurposed whatever they could find. Scarves became engine warmers. Damaged tents became wing patches. Soup cans became makeshift tools. They even used paper maps as insulation in extreme cold. Their creativity extended to survival strategies as well. Some pilots carried charcoal to mark stars on their cockpit frames. Some navigators memorized patterns of forest shape. Others tied small bells or strings to their jackets to help sense wind changes. They turned their limitations into advantages. A crucial moment for the regiment came during Soviet offensives in Belarus. The night witches provided non-stop nighttime harassment, bombing German retreat paths, bridges, and supply nodes. Their sorties created confusion and slowed the enemy retreat, allowing Soviet ground forces to encircle and destroy key German units. It was during this campaign that the regiment reached its peak operational tempo, with pilots flying up to 18 missions in a single night. Their planes returned scorched, riddled with holes, and often limping on failing engines. Yet each sunrise revealed the same sight: tired women, stiff with cold, stepping down from their cockpits and heading to briefings for the next night. The German army issued a standing order. Any pilot who shot down a night witch would automatically receive the Iron Cross. This made the women both legendary and hunted. But the more the Germans hunted them, the more the witches adapted. They changed flight paths constantly. They approached from unexpected angles. They used clouds as cover. They exploited valleys and rivers for concealment. They left behind false trails. They turned unpredictability into an art. By the time the Soviet advance pushed westward into Poland, the night witches were among the most experienced aviation units on the entire Eastern Front. They were hardened, disciplined, unbreakable. Their youngest pilots had matured into leaders. Their navigators could sense targets through instinct alone. Their mechanics had become miracle workers, keeping ancient aircraft alive despite impossible odds. Their camaraderie had deepened into a bond forged not by training, but by the shared experience of facing death together. Their missions were no longer small harassment strikes. They became part of larger coordinated operations. They destroyed ammunition trains, blew up fuel depots, and crippled German logistical networks. Their nighttime raids became so predictable in frequency and so unpredictable in pattern that German troops described them as a force that never slept, never stopped, never allowed rest. Their reputation grew with every mission. Even when they dropped only 2 small bombs, the psychological effect was immense. Men who had survived artillery shells and tank battles found themselves shaken by the whisper in the night. The winter of 1944 was among the harshest yet. Snow piled around the plains. Ice formed beneath the wheels. Temperatures dropped so low that engines froze solid and could not be started without hours of warming. Mechanics built fires under the engines to thaw them, sometimes risking explosions. Pilots wrapped blankets around their legs and arms, stuffed their boots with straw, and layered clothing until they could barely move. The cold attacked them relentlessly, but the missions continued. During this period the regiment suffered some of its most painful losses. Planes became lost in blizzard. Some crashed into forests. Others were shot down by German night fighters equipped with radar. The women mourned their fallen comrades, but they did not falter. They honored the dead by flying harder, longer, deeper into enemy territory. As the Soviet army pushed toward Germany, the night witches followed. They crossed into new territory, flying over devastated towns, ruined factories, and collapsed railways. They saw the broken remnants of war, burned vehicles, abandoned trenches, fields filled with wreckage. They also saw civilians emerging from hidden shelters, children clinging to mothers, old men staring blankly at the sky. The witches flew above all of it, continuing their mission, night after night, as the war moved toward its final, brutal climax. Every flight carried the same blend of fear, purpose, exhaustion, and determination. Every night they rose into a sky filled with unseen danger. Every night they returned with frostbitten cheeks and trembling hands. And every night they reminded the enemy that darkness belonged to them. Their legend grew not because of their weapons, but because of their will. Not because of their planes, but because of their courage. Not because of their equipment, but because of their unbreakable spirit. They were warriors made of steel wrapped in flesh, carrying the weight of their country on wooden wings. What awaited them in the final year of the war would test them more than ever before. As the war shifted into its final and most violent stages, the night witches found themselves flying deeper and deeper into enemy territory, into places where the German army was growing more desperate, more unpredictable, and more dangerous than at any earlier point in the conflict. They were no longer protecting the heart of the Soviet Union. They were now chasing an enemy that was collapsing but still full of fury. The broken German lines lashed out like a dying animal, striking with the brutality of desperation, setting traps, fortifying towns, planting flak batteries in hidden fields, and launching counterattacks that came with no warning. In these brutal final months, the night witches' missions became even more treacherous. They entered skies filled with smoke from burning cities, skies lit by artillery flashes, skies haunted by the roar of retreat and the cries of the defeated. Their wooden planes carried them into the heart of this chaos every night. By late 1944, the Soviet offensive was in full swing. Cities long occupied by German forces were being liberated one by one. But liberation came at a heavy price. The night witches flew over landscapes scarred by devastation, villages burned to black skeletons, forests reduced to ash, rivers clogged with debris, and fields pitted with endless craters. The wind that once carried whispers of their wings now carried the stench of destruction. Yet the witches did not falter. They became the constant presence above the front lines, the silent messengers of the night, reminding every German soldier that no matter how deep they retreated, no matter how much ground they lost, the darkness belonged to the Soviet Union now. Their targets grew in importance as the Red Army advanced westward. They bombed German command posts, disrupting operations. They blew up supply trains trying to escape into Poland. They struck ammunition depots hidden in forests, creating fireballs that lit the night sky for miles. They targeted bridges the Germans attempted to use for withdrawal, forcing entire divisions to abandon heavy equipment. Their small bombs, dropped with precision, became powerful tools in crippling enemy movement. They didn't need massive explosives because their accuracy made each strike count. One of the most intense chapters of their service took place during the Soviet push into Poland. Here, the night witches faced a new challenge: distance. Their missions required flying farther than before, deeper into enemy lines, and staying airborne longer. Their P2s were slow and not built for endurance, yet they adapted. They carried extra fuel cans. They learned to adjust their glide paths to conserve fuel. They memorized every river and forest that could help guide them home. They improvised landing strips in frozen meadows and swampy fields. And when the cold froze their engines mid-flight, they relied on pure instinct and training to restart them while plummeting through the darkness. As they crossed into Poland, they encountered some of the heaviest enemy fire they had ever seen. German anti-aircraft batteries crowded the retreat route. Entire divisions surrounded themselves with layers of flak cannons, expecting massive Soviet night raid. And the night witches dove straight into these traps. They flew so low that sometimes the ground crew found branches caught in their landing gear. They skimmed the tops of churches, farmhouses, and trees to avoid radar. They used valleys and riverbeds as natural flight paths, hiding within the Earth's contours. Whenever flak lit up the sky, bright explosions bloomed around them like fiery flowers. Wooden splinters flew from their wings. Engines sputtered and choked. The women kept flying. The Germans, frustrated by the witches' unpredictability, began changing tactics. They adjusted searchlights to sweep horizontally instead of vertically. They placed decoy fires to lure planes into kill zones. They coordinated flak bursts by timing the witches' glides. But the women adapted just as fast. They changed flight routes nightly. They attacked from angles that defied expectation. They switched altitude constantly. They used cloud banks to vanish. They mimicked decoy maneuvers to mislead the enemy. The night became a chessboard of danger and deception, and the witches played it with unmatched skill. By the winter of 1944, their regiment had become a highly efficient war machine. Crews moved like synchronized parts of a living organism. Pilots and navigators communicated with gestures and instinct. Mechanics repaired aircraft with incredible speed. Commanders planned missions with intimate knowledge of enemy terrain. And despite their small planes and minimal equipment, they earned a reputation for achieving near-impossible results. The Soviet High Command praised them. Newspapers across the USSR began printing stories about their bravery, and propaganda posters depicted them as symbols of unbreakable Soviet spirit. But the women themselves remained humble. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as soldiers doing what had to be done. However, their growing fame could not protect them from the brutal realities of the battlefield. Losses mounted as the regiment pressed westward. Some nights ended with multiple crews missing. Sometimes only wreckage was found, burned planes, twisted metal, scorched earth. Other times, nothing was found at all, leaving the women to mourn in silence, knowing their friends had vanished into the night forever. The pain carved deep scars into their hearts, yet they continued their missions. Every empty seat at breakfast became a symbol of both sorrow and determination. They would fly for the fallen as much as for the living. One of the most devastating losses came during a bitterly cold January night when a crew failed to return from a mission near the Vistula River. Hours passed. No engine could be heard approaching. No plane emerged from the darkness. A search team later found the shattered remains of their P2 in a snow-covered forest. It had been brought down by flak. The women had died instantly. Their comrades stood silently around the wreck, frost biting their faces, tears freezing on their cheeks. They recovered what they could, but the snow quickly swallowed the rest. They knew the risks of their mission, but the loss never became easier. As Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia and the outskirts of Germany, the night witches encountered a new enemy: the German night fighters equipped with advanced radar systems. Aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Junkers Ju-88 prowled the skies after dark, scanning for P2s with increasing efficiency. These fighters were faster, more heavily armed, and built for night combat. Their crews were trained to intercept the witches. Many night witches were shot down during this period. Some fought back with maneuvers so daring that even German pilots later admitted admiration. Others evaded capture by landing in forests and hiding their planes under snow-covered branches. One night, while flying low over East Prussia, a pair of witches were ambushed by a German night fighter. The enemy plane swooped down with guns blazing, tracers streaking across the sky. The pilot of the P-2 responded by dropping altitude until her wheels nearly skimmed the snowy ground. The German fighter overshot. The P-2 then dove into a ravine, following the twisting shape of a riverbed. The German fighter lost sight of them. When the witches returned to base, their plane had holes in every wing, their scarves were burned by near hits, and their hands were shaking. But they survived. Their commander later said it was one of the most impressive escapes she had ever seen. The enemy grew more aggressive as the front approached Germany's borders. Every night the sky flashed with explosions. Every night the German searchlights sliced through the darkness like white-hot knives. Every night the witches flew into this storm with the same quiet determination. They learned to time their engine cuts with the German artillery patterns. They learned to differentiate between flak bursts by sound. They learned which positions were decoys and which were deadly. Their senses sharpened to superhuman levels. They could smell burning fuel on the wind, feel turbulence caused by explosions, and calculate landing paths in total darkness. Their missions became even more symbolic as they moved toward Berlin. The women knew they were part of something historic. They were helping to crush the last strongholds of a regime that had invaded their homeland, burned their villages, killed their families, and turned Europe into a graveyard. Many witches carried pictures of brothers, fathers, or friends who had died in earlier battles. Their service was not just patriotic, it was personal. By the time they reached the outskirts of Germany, the witches had flown tens of thousands of missions. They had dropped countless bombs, evaded thousands of flak shells, and survived storms of steel. Their wooden planes, once mocked as toys, had become engines of fear. Their whispering wings had become symbols of relentless Soviet resistance. Their sisterhood had become one of the strongest bonds forged in the fires of war. But the greatest challenge of their lives was still ahead. Germany was cornered. The enemy was ready to fight until the last breath. Berlin loomed in the distance like a wounded beast surrounded by smoke and fire. And the night witches were heading straight for it. Their legend was about to meet its final chapter. By early 1945, as the war pressed toward its final crescendo, the night witches flew into a Europe that felt like a vast, dying world. Everywhere below them lay the scars of destruction, villages burned to ashes, bridges twisted into metal skeletons, forests carved open by shells, and fields scattered with the remains of thousands of abandoned machines. The land had become a graveyard illuminated at night by distant explosions, burning oil depots, and cities glowing under the weight of fire. This was the battleground over which the night witches soared every night, carried by their fragile wooden wings into the very heart of the dying German regime. The closer they came to Germany, the more intense and unpredictable their missions became. The German army, though retreating, was fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. Flak batteries were positioned everywhere, mounted on rooftops, hidden in barns, disguised in haystacks, buried in trenches. Searchlights spun wildly across the sky, forming frantic nets of light that reached higher and higher as the witches passed overhead. Every night the sky felt like a cage of fire. The witches adapted to this new world of chaos as they always had, with patience, instinct, and courage. They learned the rhythm of enemy fire, memorizing the timing of bursts from specific batteries. They adjusted their glides to slip between explosions. They used clouds, smoke, and even the rising glow of burning cities as cover. Their engines sputtered through freezing nights as they flew with chilled fingers gripping the controls, their breath forming crystal frost on their scarves. They moved with the confidence of aviators who had lived through years of impossible missions. Even those who were barely 20 years old had already flown more combat sorties than most male pilots would in a lifetime. As the Soviet army crossed into Germany, fear spread through the German ranks. Rumors about the night witches multiplied with every passing week. Soldiers told stories of women who flew invisible planes, women who glided without engines, women who saw in the dark, women who could not be shot down. Some German units believed they were dealing with supernatural forces. Others insisted the witches were flying prototypes or secret weapons. Few understood that these feared attackers were simply young Soviet women flying outdated wooden trainers. The disbelief itself gave the witches power. Their bases moved frequently now. Airstrips were scratched into open fields, frozen meadows, or narrow clearings in forests. The ground crews became masters of improvisation, scraping ice from wings with metal cans, warming engines with burning cloth, and patching bullet holes with whatever materials they had on hand. Bombs were dragged across muddy fields by hand. Fuel was rationed carefully. Every resource mattered. Still, the women launched into the sky every night, empowered by discipline and driven by an unbreakable sense of purpose. During one particularly harsh night, the witches were ordered to strike a heavily fortified German artillery position that had been devastating Soviet infantry advances. The target was surrounded by flak batteries, shielded by searchlights, and protected by winter storm clouds. It was the kind of mission that would have been suicidal for any larger aircraft. But the witches went anyway. They flew low across forests where snow-covered treetops brushed their wheels. They rose just enough to clear a ridge, then cut their engines, descending in eerie silence straight toward the enemy. Searchlights flared to life, slicing through the snow-filled darkness. Flak exploded above and below them. Yet one by one, the witches glided through the storm, dropping their bombs with deadly precision. The artillery position was shattered by dawn. Soviet infantry advanced without the rain of shells that had stopped them for days. The witches returned to base exhausted, frostbitten, and trembling, but alive. Their missions grew so numerous that many witches forgot what rest felt like. They flew more than any other unit, often up to 15 or 18 sorties in a single night. They returned from one raid only to refuel, rearm, and take off again within minutes. They slept in their flight suit. They woke with numb hands and stiff legs. The rhythm of night bombing became so constant that some pilots confessed they no longer felt the difference between day and night. Their world had become an endless twilight between survival and duty. In late winter, as the Red Army pushed deeper into East Prussia, the witches witnessed scenes that etched themselves into their souls forever. They flew over civilian columns fleeing burning towns, over bridges clogged with carts and abandoned wagons, over roads lined with bodies frozen in snow. They saw children clutching their mothers as distant shells echoed through the night. They saw the remnants of destroyed homes glowing like embers in darkness. They saw horses lying dead beside shattered roads. War had consumed everything. Even the witches, hardened by years of battle, felt the weight of this destruction pressing into their chests. But they also saw something else: determination. Soviet soldiers marching forward, carrying rifles through snowstorms. Tank crews sleeping beside their vehicles. Medics treating wounded by lantern light. Villagers emerging from hiding to greet Soviet troops with tears. The witches felt they were part of something larger than war. They were part of survival itself. As spring approached, their missions shifted again. They were now ordered to strike deeper into Germany, disrupting supply routes leading to Berlin. German lines were collapsing. Retreat paths clogged with traffic. Bridges were bombed. Trains derailed. The witches added their own chaos, striking at choke points, blowing up columns of retreating vehicles, and destroying ammunition warehouses. Their small bombs caused disproportionate havoc as German command struggled to maintain order. The witches began to encounter more German night fighters equipped with advanced radar. These planes hunted them relentlessly, searching the sky for the faint heat signatures of their engines. But the witches adapted. They used terrain as cover. They cut their engines and disappeared into valleys. They flew so low that their shadows touched the ground. Some crews escaped by flying directly toward the moon to blind enemy pilots. Others evaded fighters by weaving through narrow mountain gaps. Their courage was matched only by their creativity. During one mission, a group of witches was ambushed by a German night fighter squadron. The sky erupted in tracers as enemy planes swooped down from above. 3 Patus scattered, diving toward a nearby forest. One pilot guided her plane just meters above the treetops, branches scraping her landing gear. The German fighters overshot, unable to match the Patus' slow speed. The witches escaped. When they returned to base, their wings were torn and their scarves scorched, but their eyes sparkled with the adrenaline of survival. The closer they came to Berlin, the more powerful their legend grew. Soviet infantry, hearing the faint whisper of their planes above, often cheered into the darkness. The witches represented hope, courage, and relentless pressure against the enemy. Their presence in the sky meant that the Germans had no sanctuary. Their whispering wings were a promise of victory. In the final months, the witches helped destroy German ammunition depots north of Berlin, crippling enemy resistance. They bombed bridges across the Oder River, slowing German reinforcements. They struck columns trying to escape the encirclement. Their missions helped clear the path for the Red Army as it prepared for the final assault. Even with the war nearing its end, the dangers did not lessen. If anything, the enemy fought with renewed ferocity. During April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the witches flew some of their most intense sorties. Anti-aircraft guns surrounded the capital, firing non-stop. Searchlights filled the sky in a white, frantic dome. German fighters streaked through the darkness like steel arrows. The witches dove straight into this chaos, gliding silently between walls of light, releasing bombs with precision born of years of experience. Their last missions felt like the end of a long, bloody journey. They had survived winters, storms, starvation, and fire. They had survived the collapse of entire cities. They had survived night after night in fragile wooden planes. They had survived when many thought they would not even last a month. And now they were closing in on victory. As they prepared for the final operations near Berlin, many witches felt a strange mixture of exhaustion, pride, and melancholy. They had given everything to the war. Their youth, their health, their friendships, everything had been poured into the long nights over enemy territory. They were ready for the end, but unsure what life would feel like without the constant roar of engines and the whisper of wind against wings. The end was coming, but the final chapter had not yet been written. As the front drew ever closer to Berlin, the night witches entered the most intense and emotionally heavy phase of their long, brutal journey. Everything they had endured across the years, every freezing night, every deadly flak barrage, every grueling sortie, had led them to this final series of missions. The German capital stood ahead like a massive scar on the landscape, a broken metropolis filled with smoke, shattered buildings, and frantic chaos. The enemy was fighting with the fury of a dying regime, unleashing every last reserve of firepower into the night sky. The witches felt the shift in the air long before they saw the city. The sky over Germany trembled with explosions and fire. The horizon glowed as if the world itself were burning. The witches were now stationed just east of the Oder River, on a makeshift airstrip carved out of a muddy field. The ground was soft from spring rain, so wet that the wheels of their wooden planes sank into the earth every time they landed or took off. Mechanics laid planks and logs to support the weight of the aircraft. Bombs were stacked in the mud under tarp. Fuel drums were sunk halfway into the ground. The entire camp smelled of wet earth, gasoline, and smoke drifting from distant artillery bombardments. Despite these conditions, the witches moved with the precision of veterans who had long ago learned to turn hardship into routine. 4 days, the front advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Soviet artillery shook the ground day and night, firing heavy shells that echoed across the plains. Tanks rolled forward through the mud. Infantry marched past in endless lines. Yet above them all, the night witches continued their nightly dance in the sky. Their mission was clear: disrupt German troop movements, destroy supply routes, and break the last pockets of resistance blocking the Soviet advance on the capital. Each flight brought them closer to Berlin, and closer to the moment that would mark the end of one of history's most devastating wars. Their first missions near Berlin were reconnaissance strikes aimed at identifying key enemy positions. The witches flew low over forests and ruined towns, navigating by moonlight, gunfire flashes, and burning buildings. They saw retreating convoys racing along roads choked with carts, vehicles, and desperate soldiers. They saw German troops digging trenches in the fields. They saw columns of smoke rising from factories and fuel depots set ablaze. The closer they came to Berlin, the more intense the fire became. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned everywhere, on rooftops, in schoolyards, behind church walls, even inside the shell of the broken Olympic Stadium. Every night the sky over Berlin erupted in a violent storm of light and fire. But the witches did not turn back. They flew directly into the chaos, using their usual tactics of approaching at altitude, then cutting their engines and gliding silently through the storm. The Germans fired blindly into the darkness, terrified by the ghosts they could barely see. The witches had become masters of survival. They read the sky like a map of danger, slipping between explosions and beams of light with uncanny instinct. Their wooden planes trembled under the shock waves of flak bursts. Their faces burned from the freezing wind. Their hands numbed on the controls. But they pressed on, night after night. The work became more dangerous as Berlin's defenses grew more desperate. The German army had positioned its last functional night fighters around the capital, and their pilots were ordered to hunt down every Soviet aircraft they could find. Some of these German pilots had years of experience and radar-equipped aircraft. The Night Witches faced this new threat with the same resourcefulness that had carried them through the entire war. They used the terrain to disappear. They flew low enough to avoid detection. They turned off their engines to become invisible. More than once, a witch escaped a night fighter by dropping into a narrow valley or skimming the surface of a river, leaving the enemy pilot searching the sky in confusion. During one mission, a pair of witches approached a heavily defended rail junction near Berlin. As they glided in silence toward their target, a German night fighter suddenly appeared behind them. The enemy guns flashed, lighting the sky with deadly arcs. The witches reacted instantly. The pilot dropped altitude so sharply that her plane nearly scraped the ground, then pulled up at the last possible second, weaving between trees and buildings. The German fighter overshot, trying to swing back around for another attack. But in those precious moments, the witches reached the rail junction and released their bombs. The explosion lit the night like a burst of daylight. The German fighter, disoriented, lost sight of them. The witches glided into the darkness and returned to base with holes punched through their wings and smoke stains on their coat. They had accomplished their mission and lived to fly again. As the Soviet forces pushed into the outer districts of Berlin, the Night Witches intensified their missions. They struck fuel depots supplying the German defenders. They bombed bridges that connected retreating troops to escape route. They attacked artillery positions firing on Soviet ground troops. Their small bombs caused massive disruptions, forcing the Germans to waste resources and time on repairs. Each successful mission brought the Red Army closer to the heart of the city. But the danger was constant. The witches knew that every flight could be their last. Their planes were too slow to outrun anything. Their engines were too weak to climb quickly. A single direct hit from flak would turn their planes into burning kindling. Yet the women showed no hesitation. They had flown through so much death and chaos that fear no longer controlled them. They flew with the calm focus of warriors who understood that victory was within reach. The final weeks of the war took an enormous toll on the witches. They were exhausted beyond measure. Many had flown hundreds of missions without a full night of sleep. Their joints ached from cold. Their faces were cut by wind. Their hearing was damaged from constant engine noise. Their lungs burned from smoke and fuel fumes. Yet they continued without pause. Their determination came not from orders but from within. They wanted the war to end. They wanted to see their homeland free. They wanted to honor the friends they had lost along the way. As Soviet forces encircled Berlin, The Night Witches were assigned their most dangerous mission yet: support the final assault on the city by attacking German reinforcements attempting to break through the encirclement. This meant flying directly into the densest concentration of artillery on the entire Eastern Front. The sky became a torrent of fire. Explosions lit the night like thunderstorms. Searchlights swept in frantic arcs. German machine guns fired upward in wild bursts. Still, the witches flew into the storm, gliding silently with engines cut off, dropping bombs that shattered retreat routes and supply lines. At one point, the sky over Berlin was so crowded with artillery fire that the witches could see explosions below them, above them, and on both sides. Their planes shook violently. Wooden splinters ripped from their wings. Navigators held onto the cockpit edges to keep from being thrown out. Yet they remained steady, guiding their fragile planes through the narrow gaps between bursts of fire. When they returned to base at dawn, their faces were pale and their hands trembled uncontrollably. Yet when night came again, they were ready to fly. Finally, as April drew to a close and Soviet troops fought their way into the center of Berlin, the Night Witches flew what would become some of their last missions of the war. Their targets were now mostly defensive positions around the capital, artillery nests, pockets of resistance, and clusters of troops refusing to surrender. The witches flew low, navigating by the glow of explosions and burning buildings. They saw Berlin from above, a vast sea of smoke and fire, a once grand city reduced to ruins. They saw the Reichstag's silhouette rising like a broken monument. They saw rivers of refugees fleeing through rubble-strewn streets. They saw German soldiers firing from windows of collapsed buildings. They saw victory and tragedy intertwined. Their bombs did not level the city. Their goal was not destruction but disruption, one last push to break the final defenses. And they succeeded. Their repeated strikes exhausted the German defenders, forcing them to scatter and retreat. Their presence in the night sky signaled that the Soviet advance was unstoppable. Then, at last, after years of fighting, years of flying through darkness, years of risking their lives in wooden planes that should have never survived such a war, the witches received the message they had dreamed of since the day the Germans invaded their motherland. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. When the announcement reached their base, the witches stood in stunned silence. Some cried. Some laughed. Some simply stared at the sky that had been their battlefield for so long. For the first time in years, they did not have to prepare their planes. They did not have to lift bombs. They did not have to memorize new targets. They did not have to listen for the whisper of wind signaling another night of danger. But their story was not finished. Even as victory settled across Europe, the world was about to discover who these mysterious night witches truly were, and how deeply their legend would carve itself into history. When the news of Germany's surrender reached the night witches, the air around their camp changed in a way none of them could fully describe. 4 years, the night had been their battlefield, a place of tension, fear, and relentless duty. Every evening had carried the same routine: check the planes, load the bombs, memorize coordinates, prepare for the cold, the fire, and the darkness. Now the night was still. No missions. No engines warming in the distance. No officers calling out flight schedules. No mechanics rushing to patch wooden wings before sunset. The silence itself felt unreal, as if the world had momentarily forgotten to breathe. The witches stood at the edge of their airstrip and faced a sky that, for the first time in years, did not belong to war. Some wept openly, letting tears fall for the friends who were gone, for the missions that had nearly taken their lives, for the exhaustion that weighed heavily on their bones. Others held their emotions inside, staring quietly into the darkness that had once been filled with the whispers of their wings. They were young, but war had made them old. They were strong, but grief had carved deep scars into their spirits. And yet, they felt something they had not felt in years: relief, pride, and the strange, unsettling question of what came next. The world had heard of their victories, but it had not seen their faces. The whispers that had haunted German soldiers were now being given names. Newspapers across the Soviet Union began publishing their stories, stories of young women who had flown thousands of missions in fragile planes made of wood and fabric, who had defied death again and again, who had struck terror into the hearts of enemy troops who believed they were fighting ghosts. The night witches, long hidden in the shadows of the night sky, were finally stepping into the light of recognition. But recognition could not change the reality of their war. Their regiment had suffered heavy losses. Planes had vanished into darkness. Bodies had been carried home wrapped in tarp. Friends had disappeared beyond enemy lines. Many of the women carried physical scars, frostbite wounds, permanent hearing damage, lung issues caused by fumes, broken bones, and deep exhaustion. Others carried scars that could not be seen, memories of fire, screams, explosions, nights filled with fear, and the faces of comrades they knew they would never see again. When Soviet troops officially entered Berlin, the night witches were invited to witness the victory they had helped achieve. They walked through streets filled with rubble and ash. They saw buildings reduced to empty shells, vehicles melted into twisted metal, and trees charred black by fire. The victory had come at an enormous cost, and the city itself stood as a monument to the devastation of war. Civilians stepped out of basements and ruins to look at the Soviet soldiers who marched through their street. Many were hollow-eyed, exhausted, and defeated. The witches understood that they were witnessing not only the end of a war but the consequences of destruction so vast it seemed impossible to fully comprehend. Despite their extraordinary contributions, the witches faced an unexpected truth as the war ended. They would not be given the same honors as many of their male counterparts. Though more than 23,000 sorties had been flown by the 588th Regiment, though their precision and determination had helped break German lines, though they had displayed unmatched bravery, only a small number of them received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Many were overlooked. Their achievements were acknowledged, but never fully celebrated in the way they deserve. It was a bitter reminder that even in victory, the world was not ready to value women equally. Still, the witches held their heads high. They knew what they had accomplished. They knew the truth of their missions, the courage it had taken to fly through storms of steel in planes that were never meant for war. They knew how many lives they had saved by disrupting German supplies, communications, and reinforcement. They knew the fear their presence had created among enemy troops. They knew that their legacy would not be erased by medals or rank. It lived in every night they had conquered. As demobilization orders came, the witches began packing their belongings. Their airfield, once filled with the roar of engines and the smell of gasoline, grew quiet. Planes were lined up in rows, their wings still patched with bullet holes, their bodies scarred by fire and frost. Some witches approached their aircraft and placed their hands on the cold wood one last time. These planes had carried them through the darkest moments of the war. They had been their companions, their shields, their only protection against the night. Saying goodbye to them felt like leaving behind pieces of themselves. When the time came to return home, the witches boarded trains filled with soldiers from across the Soviet Union. For many, home felt distant and almost unreal. They had left as girls and were returning as veterans, women who had flown through hell and survived. Their families greeted them with tears and pride, but also with disbelief. Many people had no idea that women had served as combat pilots at all, much less flown thousands of missions. The witches carried stories that most civilians could not imagine. Life after the war was not easy. Some witches struggled to adapt to normalcy after years of living on the edge of death. Some suffered nightmares filled with the sound of flak explosions and the whisper of gliding wings. Others found strength in the friendships they had formed during the war, friendships that endured for decades. Many returned to aviation, becoming instructors, engineers, or civilian pilots. Some became mothers and passed on their resilience to a new generation. A few remained in the military, continuing their service in quieter roles. Others simply disappeared into civilian life, their wartime experiences known only to those closest to them. Time passed. The world changed. New wars were fought, new technologies emerged, new nations rose and fell. But the legend of the night witches did not fade. When historians began studying the air war on the Eastern Front, they found records of the 588th Regiment's extraordinary achievements. They interviewed surviving witches, who spoke with humility and clarity about their missions. They shared memories of frost-bitten nights, of engines that froze mid-flight, of gliding in silence above enemy lines, of bright explosions in the darkness, of comrades who never returned. Their voices became invaluable treasures of history. As the decades rolled on, the world finally caught up to the truth of what these women had accomplished. The night witches began appearing in documentaries, books, museums, and memorials. Their story spread far beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union. People around the globe were astonished to learn that in one of the most brutal and pivotal fronts of the Second World War, a regiment of young women had flown night after night in wooden biplanes, carrying out some of the most dangerous missions of the conflict. They had faced not only the enemy but also the doubts of their own commanders. And they had triumphed. Surviving witches gathered for reunions, embracing like sisters who had walked through the fire of history. They spoke of the war not with bitterness but with a deep sense of pride. They remembered the laughter in their barracks, the songs they sang to keep warm, the whispered encouragement before dangerous missions. They remembered the fallen with honor. They remembered the way the earth looked from above when the world was at war, the rivers that reflected moonlight, the forests that hid danger, the cities glowing in the night. They remembered the whisper of their wings, a sound that German soldiers had once feared, but that now brought memories of youth and courage. The world began to honor them properly. Monuments were erected in their name. Streets were named after them. Museums displayed their uniforms, their maps, their battered flight goggles, and photographs of the young women who had stared into the face of death and refused to blink. The phrase, night witches, became not a German insult but a symbol of bravery. In their later years, some witches visited schools, speaking to children about what they had done. They told them that courage did not require strength, that heroism did not require fame, that determination could overcome any obstacle. They told them that even the smallest plane could change the world when flown with purpose. They told them that fear could be defeated by discipline, and that duty could be a powerful light in the darkest night. One by one, the witches passed away, leaving behind a legacy as timeless as the stars they had once used to navigate the battlefield. Their story continues to inspire, reminding future generations that greatness can rise from the most unexpected places, and that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things when pushed to its limits. The night witches were more than pilots. They were more than soldiers. They were more than symbols. They were young women who stepped into the night with courage in their hearts, guided only by the stars and the faint whisper of wind beneath their wings. They turned fragile wooden biplanes into weapons of war. They turned darkness into their ally. They earned a place in history not by power, but by perseverance, skill, and an unbreakable will. Their wings may no longer fly across the fields of Europe, but in memory they soar still, silent, fearless, unstoppable. The whisper that once haunted enemy troops now echoes through history as a tribute to their extraordinary courage. The world will never forget the women who became legends in the darkest nights of war. The night witches live on in every story told, every monument built, every generation inspired by their bravery. And as long as history remembers the sound of those whispering wings drifting through the night, their legacy will never fade.